Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle this kind of tough topic, the American evangelical movement and how it got so tied up with politics.
Yeah.
You've given us a real mix here, articles, Alberta's book sermons, even some social media stuff.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it paints this picture of a community that's really at a crossroads.
It really is. And it's interesting how evangelical itself has become such a loaded term.
Yeah. Yeah.
It used to be about spreading the gospel, but somewhere along the way of conservative politics.
And Alberta really digs into that in his book, right? It wasn't like somebody just flipped a switch.
Exactly. He traces it all the way back.
Yeah.
The term was actually pretty vague at first,
Okay.
which had its advantages. Different Protestant groups could kind of find common ground.
Right.
But that vagueness also meant that someone could come in and reshape the movement to fit their own agenda.
So it's like they realized if they could get everybody on the same page politically, they'd have this huge cultural force at their disposal.
Exactly. And that's precisely what happened. This rise of the religious right, figures like Jerry Falwell Sr. and the moral majority, that was a turning point.
Right.
They galvanized evangelicals around these hot button issues like abortion.
Yeah.
And really mobilized them into this powerful voting bloc.
And it's wild to think that before Roe v. Wade, even a big name like W.A. Criswell could support abortion in some cases.
It really shows you how much the landscape has changed. The pro-life stance has become so central to evangelical identity now. It's hard to imagine it any other way.
Yeah.
But as Alberta points out, this laser focus on a single issue came at a cost. It really narrowed the scope of what evangelicals cared about and made it much easier to align the movement with one specific party.
So are we saying that that's when the real entanglement with the Republicans began?
You could definitely argue that.
Yeah.
And as the movement became more and more political figures like Falwell Jr. at Liberty, really pushed the boundaries.
Yeah, Alberta talks about how he turned Liberty into this powerhouse for conservative politics, but it wasn't without controversy.
It's not at all. He faced a ton of criticism for silencing dissent on campus, even going as far as to strip the College Democrats Club of recognition.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the story of Mark DeMoss, a longtime Liberty board member who was forced out for criticizing Trump's Access Hollywood tape.
That's intense. It seems like Falwell Jr. was willing to put politics above just about everything else.
It really does. And that leads us to maybe the most perplexing part of this whole story, the evangelical embrace of Donald Trump.
Right, a man whose personal life seemed to clash with so many values that evangelicals hold dear.
And Alberta really dives into this. It's
Yeah.
clear there were a lot of factors at play.
Yeah.
Some people felt threatened by what they saw as an attack on religious freedom. Others saw Trump as their best shot at getting conservative judges on the Supreme Court. And for some, it was about preserving this vision of white Christian America.
He shares that story about Pastor Robert Jeffress, who said he wanted the meanest, toughest SOB to protect the nation, and then ended up fully embracing Trump.
It's a striking example of how, for a lot of evangelicals, political expediency just outweighed any moral concerns.
Mhm.
But as Alberta makes clear, this alliance came with a very steep price.
Okay, so let's talk about that price.
Yeah.
What were the consequences of this deep dive into politics?
Well, one of the biggest was the rise of Christian nationalism, which basically merges Christian identity with American national identity.
Right.
And that's where things get really concerning for a lot of people,
Why is that?
because it blurs the lines between faith and politics to a point where it can be dangerous.
Okay.
It can lead people to believe that America has some kind of divine mandate, which can then be used to justify all sorts of things, even violence.
And we see that reflected in some of the more extreme parts of the movement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Figures like Greg Locke and Eric Metaxas, who push these conspiracy theories and use scripture to back up their political agendas.
There's that chilling story about the pastor who prayed for Colorado to be turned red with the blood of Jesus and politically, with Lauren Boebert right there in the room. It gives me chills just thinking about it.
It's a stark reminder of how fusing faith with partisan politics can just warp both.
But it wasn't just about extremism, though, right? Alberta also talks about the internal damage this political obsession caused within the evangelical community itself.
Oh yeah, one of the most worrying consequences was this decline in church attendance.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of evangelicals, especially younger folks, just got disillusioned by the constant focus on politics and the perceived hypocrisy of leaders who seemed more interested in power than actually living out their faith.
It's like they traded in their spiritual capital for political clout. And it ended up costing them way more than they gained.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about numbers either. There was this growing sense of division and conflict within churches.
Right.
Alberta shares these stories of pastors like Chris Winans and John Torres struggling to keep their congregations together as political polarization just tore through the pews.
And it wasn't contained to the church either. There's that heartbreaking story about Adam Kinzinger, a Republican congressman who got ostracized by his own family and received death threats for investigating January 6th.
They even accused him of working for the Devil's Army. It's just mind-blowing how political loyalty completely eclipsed basic human decency and family ties for some.
So it sounds like this foray into politics really backfired on them in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But was there any pushback at all? Were there any voices trying to course correct?
Oh, definitely. And that's where things start to get a little more hopeful. Alberta highlights a bunch of individuals and organizations who saw the danger of this political entanglement and started pushing back.
Okay, tell me more about that. Who are these dissenting voices?
Well, figures like Russell Moore, David French, and publications like Christianity Today, they became leading critics of Christian nationalism and the politicization of faith.
Huh?
They argued that the movement needed to go back to its core values and find a more nuanced way to engage with the public square.
So they weren't saying evangelicals should just abandon politics altogether.
And not necessarily,
Yeah.
but they were calling for a more thoughtful and ethical approach. One that prioritized Christian principles over loyalty to any party. And there were also efforts to tackle some of the internal problems plaguing the movement, like the sexual abuse scandals that had been rocking the Southern Baptist Convention for years.
That's a huge issue. How did they start addressing that?
One of the most significant developments was the Southern Baptist Convention's vote to create this database of credibly accused abusers.
Wow.
This was a massive step towards accountability and transparency, even though it faced some fierce opposition from hardliners.
It sounds like a real turning point, but I imagine the fight for reform is far from over.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
There are still powerful forces within the movement that are resisting change and clinging to the old ways.
So what does all of this mean for the future of the American evangelical movement? Is there any hope for healing and renewal?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's what we'll keep exploring as we delve deeper into your sources. You know, when you talk about cost, it's not just the internal struggles of the movement itself.
Right.
This entanglement with politics had ripple effects across American society.
Okay, so zoom out for me a bit. What kind of impact are we talking about?
Well, think about the political landscape.
Okay.
The evangelical movement, embracing such divisive rhetoric and hardline stances, really contributed to the polarization we're seeing today.
Right.
It's almost impossible to have a civil conversation about politics anymore, even with friends and family.
Oh, yeah. I feel that. And it feels like the trust in institutions has really eroded, too.
Absolutely. When you have religious leaders, these figures who are often seen as moral authorities start aligning themselves with certain parties or politicians, people start to question the integrity of all institutions.
And then there's this issue of political violence. It's hard not to think about January 6th when we talk about the dangers of mixing faith and nationalism.
And Alberta makes that connection very directly.
Yeah.
He points out that a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol were driven by this warped sense of Christian nationalism.
Right.
They believed they were fighting a holy war to save America.
It's a chilling thought. And then there's the story of Doug Mastriano, that Pennsylvania state senator, who was so involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election.
Right.
He even chartered buses to bring supporters to that January 6th rally.
Mastriano's case is a perfect illustration of what can happen when political ambition gets mixed up with religious fervor.
Yeah.
This belief that you're acting on God's behalf.
And it's not just fringe figures like him either. Even more mainstream evangelical leaders have played a role in this polarization. Alberta talks about Ralph Reed and his Faith and Freedom Coalition events, which bring together thousands of evangelicals.
Those events are fascinating to look at.
Right.
They have this almost rock concert vibe to them, with speakers who just demonize political opponents and frame elections as these spiritual battles.
It's like they've tapped into this well of fear and anxiety and channeled it all into political action.
And it's been incredibly effective at getting people to vote. But the long-term effects on American democracy are pretty scary.
So we've talked about the negative impacts. Did Alberta see any signs of hope? Were there any indications that things could change?
Well, what's interesting is that even as this political entanglement was peaking, there were cracks starting to show within the movement.
What do you mean?
Well, Alberta talks about this growing number of evangelicals, especially younger ones, who are just exhausted by the constant culture wars
Yeah.
and the politicization of their faith. They're longing for a Christianity that's less about power and more about love, compassion, social justice.
Yeah, it's like they're realizing that this focus on politics has really hurt their spiritual well-being.
Exactly. They're craving something more authentic.
Right.
And Alberta highlights some pretty inspiring people who are trying to offer a different path.
Okay.
People like Daniel Darling, who got fired from the national religious broadcasters for supporting COVID vaccines.
Oh, wow.
He's become a vocal critic of the church, getting so caught up in politics. He's calling for a more ethical and compassionate approach.
Yeah, it takes guts to speak out like that, especially when you're going against the grain of such a powerful institution.
It does. And then there are those working to fix the internal problems within the movement, like the whole sexual abuse crisis.
Right, right.
We talked about the Southern Baptist Convention's decision to create that database of credibly accused abusers.
Right, that was a huge step.
Huge.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of pushback.
Oh, I bet.
Alberta details how hardline conservatives within the Southern Baptist Convention tried to undermine these reforms. They wanted to protect the status quo.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that the battle for the soul of this movement is far from over.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the political battles and forget about the human cost of all of this. But Alberta's book isn't just about abstract ideas, it's about real people grappling with really tough questions.
You're absolutely right. And one of the most powerful parts of his book is how he weaves in his own family's story. His father's a pastor who really embodies the complexities of the movement.
In what way?
Well, he clearly had a tough time with Trump's behavior, but ultimately supported him because of his stance on issues like abortion in the Supreme Court. It's a struggle a lot of evangelicals faced.
Yeah, so even within families, this caused deep divisions.
For sure. And then there's Alberta's own journey. He grew up in the church and saw firsthand how it evolved over the past few decades.
Yeah.
His story reflects the disillusionment that many feel, but also the enduring power of faith.
It makes you wonder if it's even possible to hold on to your faith while being critical of the institutions and leaders who claim to represent it.
It's a question a lot of people are wrestling with.
Yeah.
And Alberta highlights people who are trying to find that balance.
Okay.
He talks about Pastor Brian Zond, who left the megachurch world to lead a smaller congregation that's focused on a less politically charged version of Christianity.
It's almost like a counter movement within the movement.
Exactly. And it shows that there's this growing desire among some evangelicals for a faith that's more about love, service, and social justice than political power.
So there are alternatives out there, even if they don't always get the same attention.
Right. And Alberta also introduces us to folks like Pastor Chris Winans, who, despite all the pressure and even threats, chooses to stay and lead his congregation through these turbulent times.
He represents a quiet kind of courage, this commitment to staying true to his values, even when it's incredibly hard.
Exactly. And these stories are so important because they remind us that the evangelical movement isn't just one big blob. It's a diverse community of individuals wrestling with complex questions, trying to figure out how to live out their faith in a world that's changing so fast.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture of the political stuff, the theological debates, but at the end of the day, it comes down to individual choices and the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's not popular.
And talking about standing up for what you believe in, Alberta shares a couple of stories that really show that. He talks about Nick Olson, a professor at Liberty University, who dared to challenge the political climate on campus.
I'm curious, how'd he do that?
Well, he had a pretty interesting approach. During a faculty devotional, he actually used this satirical image of Jesus wearing a "Make Israel Great Again" hat.
Oh, wow, that's bold. I can't imagine that went over well with everyone.
It didn't. But it was a powerful way to show how dangerous it is to mix up faith with nationalistic agendas, especially in a place like Liberty.
It takes a certain kind of bravery to use humor and satire to make a point, especially when you're in an environment that can be so rigid.
And then there's next Father Doug Olson, who dedicated his life to teaching at Liberty.
What was his story?
Well, he had this deep hope that education could be a force for positive change, even within an institution that was so steeped in political ideology.
So even with all the polarization and power struggles, there were people who held on to this vision of something better.
Exactly. And these stories of quiet resistance are important because they remind us that change is possible even in the toughest situations. It starts with individuals willing to speak truth to power, to live out their values and inspire others to do the same.
So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listener?
I think it's clear that the evangelical movement's political entanglement has had a massive impact both within the movement and on American society as a whole. It's led to polarization, eroded trust, and even fueled political violence. But even with all the challenges, there are signs of hope.
You're saying there are people and organizations pushing back against this trend, advocating for a more authentic and compassionate way of living out their faith.
Absolutely.
Hey.
And their stories show us that change is possible. But it takes courage, commitment, and a willingness to challenge the way things are.
So it's not just a story about decline and division, it's also about how resilient the human spirit is and the power of faith to give hope and bring about positive change. You know, it's easy to get so caught up in what's happening here in America that we forget this is part of a much bigger global story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alberta does a great job of reminding us that Christianity is evolving in very different ways around the world.
It really is a global phenomenon. And he brings up a really unsettling example, Russia under Putin.
Okay.
We've seen this rise of what he calls political religion, where the church is essentially a tool of the state used to justify all kinds of things, even military aggression.
It's kind of scary to think about faith being twisted like that. It used to prop up authoritarianism and nationalism.
It is, and it's a stark warning for us here in America. We've been talking about Christian nationalism and how it blurs the lines between faith and national identity. Well, in Russia, those lines have completely vanished.
So are you saying we could be headed down a similar path?
It's not impossible. But Alberta also points to some more hopeful examples. He talks about evangelicals in places like Australia and the UK who have managed to keep a bit more distance between their faith and their politics.
It's interesting because he contrasts that with his experience in America.
Yeah.
He tells this story about a focus group he did with church elders in South Carolina.
Right.
And it turned out that when they said evangelical, they weren't really talking about theological beliefs. It was more about cultural and political identity.
Yeah. It's almost like the word has lost its original meaning. It's become a synonym for conservative Republican.
Which is so far from what it initially meant, right? It was about evangelism, spreading the gospel. It makes you wonder if that shift has played a role in the crisis the movement's facing now.
It's definitely something to think about. And then there's the whole issue of the prosperity gospel, which has really taken hold in certain parts of the movement.
Refresh my memory. What is the prosperity gospel all about?
It's the idea that God wants you to be wealthy and successful, that material blessings are a sign of his favor.
Okay.
It's a theology that resonates with a lot of people, especially in a culture that puts so much emphasis on individual achievement and material wealth.
But it's also been criticized for distorting the true meaning of Christianity, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Critics argue that it minimizes the importance of social justice, compassion for the poor, the idea that true fulfillment comes from serving others, not accumulating wealth.
It seems like a pretty self-centered approach to faith.
It does. And it raises some ethical questions, too. Because if wealth is a sign of God's favor, then what about people who are struggling? Does that mean they're not faithful enough?
It's a tough one. So we've talked about all these challenges facing the movement. Did Alberta offer any solutions, any ideas for how things could move forward in a better direction?
He did. He really stresses the need to go back to the core values of Christianity: love, forgiveness, humility, service to others.
Okay.
He argues that the movement needs to rediscover its prophetic voice to speak truth to power and challenge injustice wherever it exists.
So it's not about withdrawing from public life, but about engaging in a way that's more consistent with the teachings of Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he points to people and organizations who are already doing this. People like Rachel Denhollander, who we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
She's been such a strong advocate for sexual abuse survivors, pushing the church to face its past mistakes and create a safer environment for everyone.
And there's Russell Moore and the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. They've been challenging the movement to engage with these complex social issues in a way that's both biblically sound and culturally relevant.
It's really encouraging to see these voices coming forward, pushing back against the status quo and offering a more hopeful vision for the future.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think it's crucial to remember that the American evangelical movement is at a crossroads. The choices it makes in the years to come will have a huge impact not just on the movement itself, but on the future of American society as a whole.
So the stakes are high, and it's up to individuals both within the movement and outside of it to decide what kind of future they want to build.
Exactly. And as you keep thinking about everything we've discussed in this deep dive, consider this. What role can faith play in healing the divisions in our society? Can it be a source of unity and hope, or will it continue to be a source of conflict and polarization?
Those are some big questions, and there aren't any easy answers. But they're worth wrestling with because the future really does depend on it. And like,